Hi, this is John Hartshorn, and welcome to episode 44 of Keep On Grooving. It's part 2 of our look at Traffic. This time we'll go over what the band and their various members did in the 70s. You literally couldn't find 2 albums in a row with the exact same lineup. Episode 44, Cross Album Traffic Part 2, 1970 to 1979. When we last left our original members of Traffic, they were all going in different directions. We've already talked about what Dave Mason was doing last year. He was hanging out with Eric Clapton, George Harrison, and Delaney and Bonnie. We'll get back to him and his debut album in a little bit. Jim Capaldi just kind of laid low after Wooden Frog broke up. Chris Wood ended up working with Steve again in a very unique project. Out of the ashes of Blind Faith came Ginger Baker's Air Force. Ginger, Steve, and Rick Gresh formed the core of it based on their time together in Blind Faith. On guitar, they recruited the former guitarist and lead singer of the Moody Blues, Denny Laine, by the way, R.I.P. to Mike Pinder. In addition to Ginger, the band also had Phil Seaman and Remy Kabaka on drums and percussion. Chris was joined in the horn section by Harold McNair and Ginger's old boss, Graham Bond. The band was rounded out by Wood's girlfriend, Jeanette Jacobs, on vocals. Their debut album was a 2-record set recorded at Royal Albert Hall in February 1970. Still waiting for something from that venue from the year before. Anyway, frankly, it looked like a more colorful successor to Wheels of Fire and its weird cover illustrations. Then to confuse people even more, it opened backwards. The 8 tracks included were a combination of songs from Ginger's back catalog and new, quote-unquote, songs, or jams is more like it. Side 1 had McNair's Dada Man, followed by Early in the Morning from the Graham Bond days. Side 2 had a new song by Steve and Ginger called Don't Care, followed by a, quote-unquote, short version of Toad, only 13 minutes. Side 3 had Aiko Baye by Kabaka and a cover of Man of Constant Sorrow sung by Denny Laine. Wonder if the Coen brothers have this album. Side 4 had a quote-unquote short version of Do What You Like, this one only 12 minutes, and Doin' It. Now the first CD reissue of the album dropped the last song. I just had to listen to it on YouTube. If you can do without 5.5 minutes of chaos, you'll be okay. In the meantime, Dave Mason kept himself pretty busy. After the Delaney and Bonnie band broke up, say that 3 times fast, he recorded an album of his own with a number of them in tow called Alone Together. It featured his own version of the Delaney and Bonnie hit Only You Know and I Know. The majority of the album was mid-tempo numbers, some of them heavy on the acoustic, others more tilted towards the keyboard. The record's finale was co-written and featuring his old Traffic mate Jim Capaldi, Look at You, Look at Me. The song's final 3 minutes are an extended guitar workout not typical for Dave. In fact, some people thought it was actually Eric Clapton making an uncredited guest appearance. Though the album featured Jim Gordon and Carl Rado from a previous and future band, Mason said Eric wasn't at the sessions at all. If you listen to the phrasing from Dave's solos on the Delaney and Bonnie box set, you can tell this is him. By the way, the album also features Johnny Barbata on drums, who just passed away a couple weeks ago. Steve Winwood also decided it was time for him to make his own solo album. He began working with producer Guy Stevens on an album he planned to call Mad Shadows. Being the musical master he was, he set out to play practically every instrument by himself. But he never quite got the drums down, so he called Capaldi in to help. They recorded 2 songs, Stranger to Himself and Every Mother's Son. During these sessions, Steve realized his songs would sound better if Chris Wood was helping out, so they called him in. With that, the solo album sessions became a Traffic reunion. Stevens departed, taking the album name with him. He later produced Mott the Hoople's second album, which was called Mad Shadows. The revived Traffic then began to work on new material with Steve and Island head Chris Blackwell producing. They came up with 4 more songs, and together with the 2 previously recorded ones, they made up John Barleycorn Must Die. Side 1 consisted of 3 of the newer songs. The opener, Glad, is an instrumental focused on the interplay between Steve's piano and Chris's saxophone, sometimes run through a wah-wah pedal. The second half slowed things down with an organ part dominating the proceedings. This flowed right into the next song, Freedom Rider. Steve's back on piano and Chris is on flute. It evokes a very old English Highlander style, like Dr. Sin's gonna ride up right beside you. Scarecrow. Side 1 ends with what should have been a hit single, Empty Pages. Steve's on electric piano and Chris backs up on organ. It's got a great atmosphere, very cool solo section in the middle, and relatively accessible lyrics. All the ingredients to a hit in 1970 or 71. They could have even edited the solo a bit to get it closer to 4 minutes, but 'twas not to be. Side 2 consisted of the 2 older songs bookending a newer one. Stranger to Himself has Steve on piano and acoustic guitar duetting with himself. With Capaldi on backing vocals, it wouldn't have sounded out of place on either Traffic or Last Exit. The new song on the side is actually a very old one. John Barleycorn is an old folk song that dates back centuries, so they played it very old style. Steve is on a capoed acoustic guitar, Chris Wood plays flute, and Jim contributes backing vocals and various bits of percussion. It's a very effective arrangement. The album ends with the epic Every Mother's Son with Steve on piano, electric guitar, and Hammond B3 organ, and Jim on drums. The Hammond sounds very much like a song he'd do a decade later that would put him back on people's radar screens, but we'll get to that one next episode. The album was released in July 1970 and did very well. It reached number 11 in the UK and hit the top 5 in the US. But, as mentioned, no hit singles. It's been reissued several times in different configurations. The 1999 single disc special edition had 2 additional songs in the album section. At the end of side 1, they added a 1.5-minute number entitled I Just Want You to Know, which fits perfectly since the last line of Empty Pages is, I just want you to know. I think they tried to play this up as the missing ending to Empty Pages. It may not have been that, but it does kind of work out perfectly. The other song at the end of the album is Sitting Here Thinking of My Love. It's one that really works better in the context of Steve's solo album that never was. The rest of the reissues dealt with another album that never was, Traffic Live. It was recorded at the Fillmore East in November, was meant to come out in 1971 but got scrapped. The 1999 reissue put what would have been side 1 at the end of the CD. An intro by Bill Graham, Who Knows What Tomorrow May Bring, and Glad. The later double disc reissue included alternate mixes and takes of what was on side 2 of the regular album. The rest included what could have been the entire Traffic Live album presented in more of a complete show. Medicated Goo, Empty Pages, 40,000 Headmen, Who Knows What Tomorrow May Bring, and Glad Freedom Rider as a medley. I like this better as an album than what was presented originally. Supposedly the original side 2 would have been Pearly Queen, 40,000 Headmen, Dear Mr. Fantasy, and Can't Find My Way Home, so we're still missing 3 of these songs. The album would have featured a new member but a familiar name, Rick Gretsch, on bass. But it was shelved for an album we'll talk about in a few minutes. A trip to New York in June provided the band with the chance to help out one of their friends, namely Jimi Hendrix. Right around the time they were playing the Fillmore, Jimmy was preparing to open his own studio, Electric Lady, on West 8th Street. The night of June 16th, Jimmy brought Chris and Steve over to have a look. Was Jim busy? The two were impressed with the setup and couldn't wait to record something. With Eddie Kramer there, they were all set to record, but they didn't have a drummer. Hey, Jim, where are you? Luckily, engineer Dave Palmer lived right across the street, and luckily his previous job was drummer for Ted Nugent's Amboy Dukes. Even though it was 2 a.m, Kramer got him on the phone and told him to get on across the street. Oddly enough, each of them recorded something separately with Jimmy, but not the 3 of them together. Steve's was a demo for Jimmy's unrealized masterwork Valleys of Neptune. According to Ultimate Hendrix, the two played off each other just like they did on Voodoo Child, with Winwood picking up the song quickly and adding his own touches to it. Jimmy and Chris then did their own loose jazz-related jam. Hopefully one, if not both of these, will make the box set whenever that comes out. To finish the night, Jimmy played them his work on Easy Rider, and to give the song an additional element, the two added backing vocals to the end of the song. In the finished version that you can hear on Cry of Love or First Rays of the New Rising Sun, you can hear Steve as clear as a bell at the end of the song. In fact, to me, it's not the song without him on the end. But where was Jim? Also, I think it was around this time that Steve did some organ overdubs for the Howlin' Wolf London Sessions album. Meanwhile, Dave Mason continued to keep busy. He ended up helping George Harrison out on his epic All Things Must Pass album. During those sessions, Eric Clapton, Bobby Whitlock, Carl Radle, and Jim Gordon formed the core of Derek and the Dominos. Mason joined the band in recording one of their earliest songs, Roll It Over. When the band made its debut, I think it was at the Lyceum, Mason was along playing second guitar. I don't think a set list has ever emerged from that date, but Whitlock is on record as saying their arrangement of Clapton's Easy Now with three-part harmonies was amazing. However, this was his only date with the band. As we know, another D name would join the album recording soon enough, Duane Allman. Dave returned to the States and ended up making an album with an unlikely partner, Cass Elliot. The two met and hit it off, so they ended up working together. It was more a Mason album with Cass mainly on backing vocals, but her name was there in the album title. However, in 1971, somehow the idea of rejoining Traffic came up. But it would be an even bigger band than the quartet version he'd been in before. He joined current members Winwood, Capaldi, Wood, and Gretsch, plus two additional members. While touring in Sweden, they met percussionist Rebop Kwakaba, not to be confused with Remy Kabaka, Lord knows I was, and they asked him to join the band. Then in mid-1971, drummer Jim Gordon joined so Capaldi could concentrate on vocals and percussion. As we discussed last year, Derek and the Dominos went up in flames after a confrontation between Clapton and Gordon, which freed Jim up to join Traffic. The seven-man band played 6 dates in the UK over the summer. One of them was recorded in the canteen of the Polytechnic of Central London, which ended up giving its name to their next album, Welcome to the Canteen. Their set list was generally a first set of Traffic songs, a second set of Dave Mason songs, more Traffic songs, and an encore of Gimme Some Lovin'. For the album, they chose the usual opener, Medicated Goo, Mason's Sad and Deep as You, 40,000 Headmen, and another Mason song, Shouldn't Have Took More Than You Gave. For side 2, they picked the 11-minute Dear Mr. Fantasy and 9-minute Gimme Some Lovin'. Side 1 is generally tight, side 2, less so. Dave seemed to really enjoy the return to the group and wanted to take this incarnation of the band to the States. But Steve wanted to get the band into the studio, maybe sensing this may not last long. So Mason left again, but this time for good. However, he'd be back in the limelight soon enough. We'll get to his later work in a bit. The live album was released in September and hit number 26 in the US and was the last for them on United Artists Records. In the UK, however, it missed the charts entirely. Strange for a band that had a lot of success in England on the charts. The new 6-man incarnation of the band returned to the studio the same month the live album came out. With such a broad array of talent, they looked to utilize everyone to the fullest. It's fair to say the album they created was the most diverse in the band's catalog, with the low spark of High-Heeled Boys. Now, where the heck did they come up with a name like that? Well, it comes from a unique source, actor Michael J. Pollard. He's most famously known as a member of the Barrow Gang in Bonnie and Clyde with Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, who was also a guest star on Star Trek. He was working on a movie with Capaldi that never happened. Maybe that's why Jim couldn't stop by Electric Lady Studios. Anyway, while scribbling notes for the film, Pollard wrote this phrase, the low spark of High-Heeled Boys. So what does it mean? According to Capaldi, low spark was that kind of street energy rebel vibe, so that's where that part comes from. Now, high-heeled boys did have a connotation in Europe, namely mob assassins. But Jim said that's not what it's about at all. Funny, there's a man with a gun in the chorus of the song. We'll talk about that in a minute. So if that's not what the title is about, then I have no idea. The album came out 2 months later in November. Very quick turnaround. It opens with the song Hidden Treasure. Sounds kind of like a follow-up to 40,000 Headmen, and it's an acoustic-based number, but Gordon's jazzy drums and Rebop's percussion give it an entirely different feel. Then comes the epic title track, nearly 12 minutes long. It slowly fades in, first hearing Steve's piano, then Jim's drums, Chris's sax, and Rebop's congas. As it builds in volume, Winwood's Hammond B3 comes in. About a minute into the song, the sound of a vibraslap happens, and it switches from D major to D minor for the verses. Steve plays a very percussive figure on the piano, which Jim follows up on the drums. They do the first verse, which modulates back to D major for the chorus, followed by a short solo section. Then the second verse and chorus moves into a long solo section. The bass is held by Steve's piano and Jim's drums, and the main solo is done by Steve on an organ run through some kind of fuzz. At least that's kind of how I replicated it with my Yamaha and pedals through my amplifier. It runs around 4 minutes and builds and builds and builds, with Steve doing yeahs in the background, kind of like when Jimmy would always send something to go really good. Yeah! It explodes with the three instruments riding into a crescendo before winding down. Now, Capaldi had only written 2 verses, but during the recording he came up with a third and got it in front of Steve right before he had to come in for the finale. Talk about perfect timing. The third verse ends. We don't get a third chorus vocally, just instrumentally. To the sound of the dissonant organ, the song fades out. As you could tell, I absolutely love this song. It's one of the most perfectly produced songs you can find anywhere. As a comparison, Steve released a mix of the original sessions on one of his best of albums. It's about 45 seconds, and usually I like those more. But in this case, the edits were made in just the right places and helped the song take shape. I'm kind of surprised it wasn't given a single edit. You could have created a solid 4.5 to 5 minute version out of it. As it was, it did get a lot of FM airplay. It was a staple of classic rock stations, but the most interesting time I heard it on the radio was back in 1987. I was taking a bus home from Rutgers in New Brunswick to the Brunswick Square Mall. The bus driver had on the local easy listening station, Magic 98.3. Suddenly, I hear Low Spark coming over the radio, and I'm in shock. This is completely out of the box for this station, especially in the middle of a Friday afternoon. And ended up playing the whole song. A couple years later, they did a Labor Day weekend best of countdown where I ended up hearing things like Stairway and Layla, so someone there must have been a classic rock fan. The last song on side 1 is, well, it depends what version you have. I'm going to go with the one I have, which appears to be the original. Light Up or Leave Me Alone is about, well, you can figure it out. Capaldi takes his first vocal since Dealer on the first album. Steve also does the main part of the song on guitar. He also does the organ part, leaving Chris with nothing to do in the studio version, but he played the keyboard part live. It's kind of a mellow song befitting the subject matter. Now, the first song on side 2, or the last song on side 1, is unique in the Traffic catalog in that it's the only one on all their albums not involving any of the original members as one of the writers, John Barleycorn accepted. Rock and Roll Stew was written by Rick Gresh and Jim Gordon. It also gives Jim Capaldi a second lead vocal for the only time on the studio albums. It's a very funky number with Gordon laying down a solid groove and Winwood pitching in on guitar again. Now, oddly enough, this was the song selected as the single. And even odder was the B-side was Rock and Roll Stew Part 2. Part 1 on the A-side is a slightly edited version of the album track, Part 2 is an extended jam at the end that picks up somewhere in the middle of the album ending. So if you wanted to make a complete version of the song, you need to take the album version and then splice the part 2 ending onto that, giving you a song about 6 minutes and 45 seconds. The next song is either the second track on side 2 or the first. For some reason, some track listings have Light Up moved to the middle of side 2 and the other two songs bumped up in the running order. Anyway, Many a Mile to Freedom is written by Steve and Jim, but earlier releases had Anna Capaldi. Now, Jim's wife name is Aninha, but they didn't get married until 1975. I don't know if they were dating yet, but this would kind of piece together. The song centers on Steve's interplay with himself on guitar and electric piano, with Chris's flute floating in and out. The album ends, on all versions, with Rainmaker, which has a similar vibe to it, which is maybe why some versions split these last two up. The first part is mainly the same kind of vibe as Many a Mile, acoustic and mellow. Then the second part of the song cranks up with Chris switching to sax and Steve turning up the electric guitar. The album has one other distinguishing feature. The top right and bottom left corners are cut off, giving the album a sort of 3D cube-like illusion. Chart-wise, the album had the same odd Atlantic dichotomy. In the UK, it missed the charts completely, leaving no ripple at all. They just toured the country over the summer, and it didn't move the needle at all. In the US, it was a top 10 album and went gold in a matter of months, eventually reaching platinum status 5 years later. So things looked like they were rolling along, until they weren't. Right after the album came out, Gordon and Gretsch were fired due to excessive drug use. Rick did some session work, appeared at Clapton's Rainbow shows in early 1973 with Steve and Jim, that must have been comfortable, and did a few solo albums but left the industry in the late 70s. He passed away in 1990 from the effects of alcoholism. We discussed the tragic end of Jim Gordon's life last year. He passed away just before we did the Clapton episodes in March of 2023. 1972 brought more bad news with Steve Winwood's struggles with peritonitis, forcing him to take some time off. Capaldi decided to use the time to make his own solo record, Oh How We Danced. One of the songs included was Open Your Heart, which was recorded during the Low Spark sessions. The bulk of the rest of it was recorded at the Muscle Shoals Sound Studios, and you know what Muscle Shoals has? Right, the Swampers. If you ever wanted to know what that reference is in Sweet Home Alabama, it's the nickname of the house band at the studio. Jimmy Johnson, no, not 7th Time Number 48, he's the guitarist, Barry Beckett's on keyboards, Dave Huda on bass, and Roger Hawkins on drums. Considering Traffic would be in need of a bass player and drummer, Jim recruited David and Roger to join the band. Once Steve recovered, Traffic went back on the road. The new lineup was captured on film almost immediately as a set at the Santa Monica Auditorium with videotape. It remained unreleased for over a decade, but selections of it became staples on classic MTV, and eventually they ran the whole video on Saturday night concerts. The show consisted of a 13-minute version of Low Spark High Heel Boys, Light Up or Leave Me Alone, John Barleycorn, Rainmaker with a rebop conga solo, Glad, Freedom Rider, 40,000 Headmen, and Dear Mr. Fantasy. Now, Steve's guitar of choice was interesting, a Fender Jaguar instead of the usual Les Paul or Stratocaster. Steve also took part in the All-Star London Symphony Orchestra presentation of The Who's Tommy, playing Captain Walker, as well as recording an album with Remy Kabaka. In late 1972, the band went into the studio to record their next album. The results hit the record stores in February 1973, Shootout at the Fantasy Factory. It also had the corners cut off like Low Spark, and the cover looks like it depicts the conclusion of the title, which could have been perpetrated by the High Heel Boys from the previous album, but I digress. All tracks were written by Steve and Jim, except for the instrumental Tragic Magic, which was written by Chris. That song also had the other two members of the Swampers, Barry and Jimmy, on the song. The album kicks off with the 6-minute title track. It definitely has a groove, but the lyrics, I'm not sure what's going on. I know Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck get mentioned. The one thing I most remember about the song is how many times I turned around when the siren goes off in the middle of the song, thinking, well, what did I do? The rest of the side consists of Roll Right Stones. They were apparently going for a similar vibe to Low Spark with a 10-plus minute song, in this case, 13 and a half. It goes through several movements and different feels. I'm just not sure why this song needs to be this long. It goes a lot of places and not really anywhere at the same time. But there are some times when I'm in the mood, it's a nice trip when you're in the right frame of mind. Side 2 starts with Evening Blue, another song that could have been a hit single in this era. It's only 5 minutes or so. It's as mellow as the title and has interesting keyboard choices. It should have been a hit. Next is Tragic Magic, the Chris Wood instrumental with all 4 Swampers on the track. It's a cool jazzy number with a couple of interesting tempo changes. The album ends with the somewhat inappropriately named Sometimes I Feel So Uninspired. Never give your critics ammunition. The funny thing is, it's probably the most inspired song in the album as Steve wails out on guitar at the end. I also notice a resemblance between the chorus of this song and the main melody of George Michael's One More Try. I always find myself singing, "Bad luck and trouble is following me," at random parts of that song. So, one odd thing about the record is only the initial US release was complete. Somehow an edited tape with Uninspired shortened by around 30 seconds and Roll Right Stone missing a full 2 minutes was released everywhere else. Then the US tape went missing and all versions became the edited one. It wasn't until the CD remastered that this error was corrected, 30 years later in 2003. Despite its less than enthusiastic critical reception, the album hit the top 10 in the US again, making it all the way to number 6, their highest charting album. Riding that wave, the band toured the US and Europe with Barry Beckett joining the band on keyboards, opening up Steve to do more on stage. By the end of the year, their second live album hit the record shelves, On the Road. Get it? Traffic on the road? Anyway. However, it depended on where you got the album that decided whether you got a 1 or 2 record set. The album was recorded in Europe, so they got the full version. The album kicked off with a 20-minute rendition of the Glad Freedom Rider medley, the bulk of it being taken up by a very extended coda to Glad. Side 2 had a normal-length shootout at the Fantasy Factory and an extended Light Up or Leave Me Alone featuring full band introductions. Side 3 was the Tragic Magic Uninspired twofer, both of them getting around a 2-minute extension. And Side 4 was an almost 18-minute version of Low Spark of High Heel Boys. As you can see, the shorter numbers took a back seat here. There was nothing shorter than 6 minutes. However, in the US, record buyers there received a truncated version of the album. Side 1 consisted of a slightly edited version of Low Spark of High Heel Boys to around 15 minutes and the full shootout at the Fantasy Factory. Side 2 was Sometimes I Feel So Uninspired and Light Up or Leave Me Alone. And that was it. That was the album. This may have contributed to its relatively lackluster showing, hitting only the low 20s. However, in the UK, it broke the band's losing streak and hit the charts once more. Eventually, the US got the full version when I started collecting Traffic in 1988. The double album version was the only one you could find. So the band looked like they were finally on a relatively stable footing, until Steve fired David, Roger, and Barry, saying he wanted to bring the band's sound back to its roots with a smaller version of it. So they went back to Alabama to become immortalized in song by Lynyrd Skynyrd, while Traffic hired a new bass player, Roscoe G. Steve's idea of making the band smaller also got a boost when he ended up firing Rebop in the middle of the sessions for their next album due to overindulgence in narcotics, let's put it that way. Problem is, Chris was in the same boat, but he kept his job for now. When The Eagle Flies was released in September 1974, the sessions for it lasted close to a year. As mentioned, Rebop was fired but ended up staying on 2 tracks. Steve expanded his keyboard to include a Mellotron and a Moog, the kind you could hear at the end of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Lucky Man. I'm going to be honest, I've had this album in my collection since 1990, It wasn't released on CD back then, so I had to get a vinyl copy at Cheap Thrills, the record store in New Brunswick near Rutgers. It used to be at the corner of George and Church near Albany, aka Route 27. I finally did get the CD in the early 2000s. It took that long to get out. It's been in my iTunes for however long I've had iTunes. And I've never listened to the album all the way through. So just for this podcast, for the first time in the 50 years it's been out, I listened to When the Eagle Flies. So let's go over it. The album opens with the appropriately named Something New. And for Traffic at that point, it was just that. A short, punchy pop-type tune that lasted just over 3 minutes. It just has Steve on piano and guitar, Roscoe on bass, and Jim on drums. Chris may be on a low sax in the background, but nothing prominent. Next, we're back to old Traffic with Dream Gerard, with 2 R's, an 11-minute epic. But it was also significant in that it was written by Vivian Stanshall, who collaborate with Steve on a later recording. The Gerard of the title is French poet Gerard, with 1 R, de Nerval, whose style Viv tried to emulate in the lyrics. It's more of a feeling piece than a song per se. Steve goes wild on the keyboards. He played piano, electric piano, Mellotron for the first time in a Traffic record since I think the first album, and the Moog synthesizer. It's not quite as memorable as Low Spark, but it's an easier listen than Roll Right Stones. Side 1 ends with Graveyard People, an ultra 70s sounding song with the Lalo Schifrin-ish Dirty Harry-esque electric piano and the Moog making odd noises in and out. It's kind of very similar to what Patrick Moraz of Yes was doing at the time over on Relayer, a definite relic of its time. Side 2 kicks off with one long song, Walking in the Wind, a very mellow number that, if you listen to it now, it sounds very much like another song later in Mr. Winwood's career. We'll be getting to that one next episode. It's the same one I talked about earlier. It only modulates off its established pattern a couple of times, and towards the end it reminds me of a Tony Banks type solo a la Firth of Fifth or Cinema Show. The rest of the album has relatively normal length songs, nothing over 5 minutes. Memories of a Rock and Roller is first written from the viewpoint of someone who's been on the road for the past 10 years, like Steve and Jim. Winwood goes to the guitar for this one and utilizes the Clapton-Leslie badge sound, for lack of a better term. It then kicks out at the end with Chris coming in on sax and Steve on organ. Next up is Love, a song that wouldn't have sounded out of place in the Carole King, James Taylor, Carly Simon, Joni Mitchell category. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of Mitchell's Help Me from 1974. The album ends with the title track, the most Traffic-sounding song on their record. One of the ones with Rebop Graveyard People is the other. It almost sounds as if the band is waving goodbye, but didn't know it at the time. They recorded at least one more song for the album, Chris Wood's Moonchild Vulcan, which took until 2007 to finally see a release on a Wood retrospective collection. The album did okay, hitting the top 10 in the US again, and actually making the UK charts at number 31, but disappeared after a week. The band went on tour, but it took a heavy toll on half of them. Steve was still suffering from peritonitis reoccurrences, and Chris continued his heavy indulgence in drugs and alcohol. Then during a show in Chicago, Winwood walked off stage from exhaustion and never came back. The rest of the guys decided he was too integral a part of their material to continue, so they called it quits right there. Looks like this was the end of Traffic once and for all. And it was. For now. Roscoe ended up joining with Rebop in the band Can. They're one of those groups that I remember MCA and Reissue Guru, Bill Levinson. They put out these 2 CD retrospective of obscure bands like Can and Camel and Caravan. What a time the early 90s was. Jim and Chris continued to work. Steve, however, took some time to recover. In 1976, he joined Japanese keyboardist Tomu Yamashita. Say that 5 times fast. And former Santana drummer Michael Shreve to form Go, a jazz fusion outfit. They recorded a studio album with Roscoe on bass for most of the tracks, as well as jazz master Al Di Meola on guitar for a number of tracks. Later that year, they released a live album from Paris, which is basically a live version of the studio album, just with the songs in a different order. At that point, Steve was getting pressure from Island, who released the Go albums, to put out his own record under his own name. So in 1977, the album entitled Steve Winwood finally arrived. He called up Jim, and the duo wrote 4 of the album's 6 songs. The second track, Time Is Running Out, being the closest to a Traffic song. He did one with Viv Stanshall and one completely on his own, Midland Maniac. That song was not only solely written by Steve, but he performed every instrument on the track as well. The rest of the album featured Capaldi, Rebop, guess they smooth things over, session masters Andy Newmark on drums and Willie Weeks on bass, and Reggae Star Jr. Mervyn on guitar for one song. But much like Traffic, the album didn't yield a hit single in the States and made it to number 22, bit of a disappointment. In the UK, it made it all the way to number 12, but the singles didn't chart there either. However, one member of Traffic did hit the singles charts in the 70s. Dave Mason had a bit of a rocky road after leaving Traffic for the final time. After 2 sort of successful albums for the small Blue Thumb label, he sought to renegotiate his contract. It didn't work and he left for Columbia. Blue Thumb then released his final album, Headkeeper, with some live tracks from the Troubadour in LA, followed by Dave Mason Is Alive, featuring tracks from the same show, including 2 that were just on the previous album. Mason then released a string of albums for Columbia starting in 1973 that did okay, but not great. Ironically, the first album in that run not to hit the top 40, Let It Flow hit number 41 in 1977, was the album that gave him his biggest hit. And it wasn't even one of his songs. For the second track on the album, Dave recorded a song written by his regular guitar player, Jim Kruger. It was a mellow acoustic number that fit in well with the relaxed songs of the era. Alice Cooper's You and Me would be another example of this. It must have taken everybody by surprise that We Just Disagree not only made the top 40, but got all the way up to number 12. From how often I heard it on the radio, I could have sworn it was a top 10 hit. Alice Cooper's You and Me being another example of this, also hitting number 12. But a hit is a hit. Oddly enough, it only hit number 19 on the adult contemporary chart, the type of stations where this song has lived ever since. And to add to its notoriety, Bob Dylan covered it during his 1980 tour. Unfortunately, Dave never really followed up on it, though he did have one more album that got some notice thanks to the participation of his former bandmate. Steve Winwood decided not to tour for his 1977 self-titled album and did session work for the remainder of the decade. He helped 60s songstress Marianne Faithfull on her comeback album Broken English, playing on the title track and the Ballad of Lucy Jordan, which kind of sounds like a precursor to Pat Benatar's We Belong. He also played on the lead-off song for George Harrison's self-titled album in 1979, Love Comes to Everyone, which also included his old bandmate Eric Clapton. Around 2 minutes in, Steve plays a pitch-bending solo on the Mini Moog keyboard, the like of which we'd hear again very soon. Yep, that song again. It was just a hint of things to come. Next time Steve Winwood hits the big time, and out of nowhere, Traffic returns once more. That's next time on Keep On Grooving. Please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm John Hartjar. Thanks for listening.